In this tutorial, I will continue explaining how AwareIM works with business rules. I will explain the concept of context and instance prefixes. Please make sure that you watch the business rules, business processes, and rule execution tutorials before watching this one. We'll start with the concept of context, which is key to understanding how business rules work in AwareIM. When you write a business rule, you imply that the rule will be applied to some instances of business objects. For example, when you write customer.lastname equals Smith, you imply that the value of some customer object will be changed to Smith. But which instances will the new value be applied to? When actions of the rules are executed, they are always applied to instances of business objects that currently exist in the context. Think of a context as a special storage where AwareIM puts instances of objects for rules to work with. How do these instances get into the context in the first place? In some cases, AwareIM populates the context automatically behind the scenes. As you already know, rules attached to business objects are executed when some instance of a business object is being created, modified, or deleted. In this case, AwareIM automatically puts the instance being created, modified, or deleted into the context. So for example, when you write a rule of a customer object, it will be automatically applied to the instance of the customer being created, modified, or deleted. In other cases, the context is populated explicitly by the developer. For example, when a rule executes the find action that searches for instances of objects that match a certain criteria, all instances of the found objects are placed in the context and become available to subsequent rules. It is important to note here the difference between business rules attached to business objects and processes. Because rules attached to objects execute in no particular order, the context created by the find action only exists when the rule using the action is executing, and so it is only available to subsequent actions in the same rule, but not to other rules of the object. In processes, however, instances found by the find action become available to all rules that follow the rule using the action. Let's look at the library sample application for an example. In this application, we have the item object, which represents the library item. There is a rule attached to this object called current reservation. This rule determines current reservation when the reservations of the library items are changed. When the rule is executed, the item is already in the context. The rule finds the first waiting reservation and makes it current. The reservation found by the first action is available to the second action only, but it is not available to other rules of the item object. And now let's look at the process of the library application called test charge fee. The first action of the process finds library members with the first name John. All instances found by this action become available to all subsequent rules of the process. Other actions that put objects in the context are those that create objects or duplicate them, such as create, enter new, and duplicate. For example, the fee object created in the test charge fee process here is placed in the context and becomes available to this subsequent rule. There are also two instances that are always implicitly present in any context for any rule, in object rules or process rules. These are system settings object and the currently logged in user. There is always only one instance of the system settings and logged in user in the system, and you can refer to them in your rules without having to find them. For example, if we look at the loan object, there is a rule called total items validation. This rule uses the system settings object and it correctly assumes that it is in the context. Or if we look at the view item process, So review member process. It uses the logged in user. The rule uses the logged in prefix that I will explain a little later. You can use objects in the context in your queries and even visual perspectives. Let's look at the Crm Sample Application for an example. There is a process in this sample application called Staff Member Diary. The process first creates the staff member param object and then displays the query. And if we look at the query, we can see that it relies on the fact that the staff member param object is already in the context, and it finds appointments with the same staff members as indicated in the parameter object. Processes, however, are different. They do not use the context of the calling rules. When a process starts executing, a variable always creates a special context for the process and only automatically puts those instances of the objects that are indicated by the process input. For example, let's look at the close loan process of the library application. Here we can see that the loan object is declared as input for this process. The process is called from another process, which is called test close loan. The process is called here. As you can see, the calling process finds the loan object before calling the close loan process. Because the loan object is declared as process input for the close loan process, the found instance will be in the context of the close loan process when it starts. But the sub-process does not inherit the entire context of the calling process. The context of the calling process also contains the item object, which is declared as process input for the calling process. But this object is not transferred into the context of the sub-process because it is not declared as input of this process. If the find action here finds more than one instance of the loan, the close loan process will be called for each found instance independently. This is very important, and it is worth repeating again. If a calling process puts multiple instances of the object declared as process input for a sub-process, when the sub-process starts, its context does not contain all instances of the object found by the calling process. Instead, the context of the sub-process contains only one instance, but the sub-process is called as many times as there are instances of the object in the calling process's context. So to recap important points about contexts of processes, the entire context of the calling process is not inherited. Only the objects declared as process input are placed in the context of the sub-process. If there are multiple instances of the object declared as process input for a sub-process in the context of the calling process, the sub-process is called as many times as there are instances of the object in the context. For each call, the context of the sub-process contains only one instance of the object declared as process input. Another time when a variable puts instances of the objects in the context is when the user invokes operations that start processes or run queries. For example, let's write a process that will duplicate the staff member in the Crm application. So we will create a new process, and our process will assume that the staff member to duplicate is already in the context of the process. So we must declare the staff member object as input of the process. Now we will write a rule that will duplicate the staff member. We have a query in the application that shows staff members. We can add an item operation to this query that starts our process. At runtime, a variable will automatically put the current staff member in the context of our process. Let's see this in action. So here I am in the Crm Sample Application. So let's run the query to show staff members. And here I can see that each staff member has a button that runs our process. If I click the button next to Fred Wilson, for example, a variable will automatically put the record with Fred Wilson into the context of our process, and the record will be duplicated. Similarly, we could put the operation on the form of the staff member object, and again, at runtime, a variable would populate the context with the instance of the staff member whose form is being shown. Let's now talk about instance prefixes. What if there are two instances of the same object in the context and we want to distinguish between these instances? For example, suppose that in our process that duplicates the staff member, we want to show the form of the duplicate straight away. By the time the duplicate action finishes its execution, there are two staff members in the context, the original one placed there by a variable automatically, and the duplicate created by the duplicate action. So how do we tell the system to use the second instance of the staff member to view? You can use instance prefixes to distinguish between the instances in the context. Instance prefixes are specified before the name of the object. The first instance will be the instance specified in the process input, and it can be referred to with the this prefix. The second one will be the duplicated one, and it can be referred to with the that prefix. So to view the duplicate, which is the second instance, we need a rule that looks like this. View that staff member. If you need to distinguish the third instance or more, you will need to create a special process for this and make sure that each process uses no more than two explicit instances. This is, however, very rarely needed. There is also the other instance prefix, which can be used to refer to all instances of the object other than the first one, or this instance. Here is another example of using instance prefixes. Let's look at the rule that checks uniqueness of the login name of the user. The rule needs to compare the login name of the current user, or the user that is being created or modified, with the login names of all other users in the system. It uses the aggregate expression exists to check all existing users. To distinguish between the existing users and the current user, the rule uses the this prefix to refer to the user in the context rather than the user in the system. Another example of using instance prefixes is the logged in user that I have already mentioned before. You can always refer to the currently logged in user by the logged in prefix followed by the name of the user object or system user group. And another example of instance prefixes is when you use the was added to or was removed to conditions in your rules. Using was added to and was removed to is actually a great way to use business rules attached to the changes in some list represented by a multiple reference attribute. For example, let's look at the converted reservation rule attached to the reservation object of the library application. There is the rule here. What happens here is that the library member made a reservation for the library item. When the item becomes available, the reservation is converted into a loan, and the status of the reservation is changed from offered to converted. The rule here checks the fact that a new loan was added to the list of loans for the item that the reservation is for, and that the status of the added loan is current, and if so, it changes the status of the reservation. Here, when referring to the loan object which has been added to the list of loans, we use the added prefix. Similarly, we could use the removed prefix together with the was removed condition.